This moment that we're living collectively of divisiveness, of finding ourselves situated on one side or the other of a line that's dividing us, and of the resources that we have for thinking about what's going on and really addressing it in a way that's honest and productive. And we were speaking the last time about this idea that we have sort of different seats in our home where we let guests sit when they come to visit. As an analogy for where we position people in our way of responding to them, speaking to them, or thinking about them. So where do we situate people and ourselves relative to those people? And that's a way for us to start to de-solidify the sense of I'm here and this is who I am and where I am, and that other person is over there. Because we shift the focus slightly and recognize that we are positioning constantly ourselves and others. And how we position ourselves relative to others affects where they need to be in their interactions with us, where we put them. And it also affects us. We create a certain identity when we relate to the person that we think of as other to ourselves. And it's really fundamental to Buddhist thinking to be attentive to the way that self relates to its others and what the self is and how who we are gets defined in contrast to an other is something that we hear about in lots of other modes of thinking, and Edward Said with his reflecting on Orientalism and how we use the Orient as a way to define who we are, has a kind of much more maybe psychological or personal or spiritual sort of counterpart in the thinking in Buddhism about the way that our mode of perceiving subject and object, self and other, gets turned into the world that we live in through emotional responses where we are pushing people away, or where we're trying, usually fruitlessly, to bring people towards us because our way of perceiving them is already generating this sense of self and other. We have in Buddhism the teachings on interconnectedness as a way to shift the focus from this model of two things united by either a distance or maybe just one little connection, to where we're seeing that interconnectedness actually means that we cannot understand who we are without understanding who our others are, who we consider to be different from us or other to us. And in Buddhist theory of language, we have this notion that we come to know what things are by saying they're not that. So thinking about how children acquire language and we give them a word for ball. And then they start using ball to point to other things, and we start saying, no, that's not a ball, that's a cup. Right? My favorite example. I always use ball. I don't know why. I think because I do it usually in Spanish, and I really like the sound of the word for ball in Spanish, pelota. We had a dog in India who was named Pelota, but I didn't name him, but that's another story. So in this, the way that children are taught language, we can see this process of, no, that's not that, that's something else. And when we think about the way that we construct categories by marking out, no, that's where you are no longer this, you become something else. You are something else. We can see echoes of that, or actually the functioning of that, in the construction of gender categories, which makes it a cause of so much anxiety when suddenly there's something that it's not staying properly on the side of the line, and it makes the line murky, and it makes the categories difficult to figure out how to maneuver and where are we, because it really is an interesting question. Why would it cause us so much anxiety collectively? Maybe not that much as individuals, because we might have worked on it, but for many people, the response to seeing people whose gender identity is not clearly defined is a kind of anxiety. And there are studies that, have explored this fact. And so the idea that we are figuring out what things are by making a clear line to demarcate them from what they're not, as a way of constructing language, is another way of saying that things in and of themselves don't have an essence, that it doesn't matter what everything else is, we're just going to figure out what the essence of this is. Okay, and I know this is we went very quickly to philosophy. That wasn't really the plan, but somehow it's like a magnet that kind of pulls some people there. So this idea that we really rely on others to tell us who we are. Not just in verbally giving us the title of, Dr. So-and-so, or, Mr. So-and-so, or this, president or director. Not only in terms of giving us positive feedback about who we are, although that also is part of it, but even just for us to know who we are, we need to know what we're not. And so you take that mode of functioning and bring it into election time. And who we are, we know who we are because we're not them. And so this same function that makes it so important for us to have clearly defined gender categories and different roles in different situations, and we need to have our boundaries set clearly so that we know who we are and who we're not. When we bring that into this collective space, which is another fictional construction, a nation, which, where does a nation exist? Maybe the nation exists, and then there's other thinkers who've suggested that this is a way to think about it, is that a nation is created through fiction. Because through the modern novel, we learn to think through the eyes of other people that we wouldn't know. And all the people who are in our country, when we learn to think through their eyes, we start getting an idea of what our nation is about. And so we have these mental constructs, which is a nation, which is, of course, established then as institutions and so forth. But the nation itself is an idea. It's something held together by thought, right? Which means our mind is placing limits. What are the boundaries? And so when we have that way of operating, even when we share passport, which maybe that's all we share, in some sense. We share a passport, and then within this large group, assuming that now we're not focusing on who we're not, how do we know who we are here? So one way is to constantly have this idea precisely of what we as a group are not. So if we're Americans, we are not those other people who are not American. And so you understand that in order to establish that we are this group of people, we need this constantly evoked presence of some other who's not us, and who is probably menacing us or threatening us or planning to attack us, and therefore let's unite and defend ourselves. This is a phenomenon that, we all have observed. Now, within this nation, within this fictional entity, what we start to see is who gets to say what this is. When we're not thinking too much, it can just be evoked. We can all have some idea. We don't need to have the same idea, but we all have some idea that we're not that, we're this. But then when you need to establish policy and figure out how we're going to make this manifest, then we come into the question of who gets to represent this. And because this is basically an idea, the nation is an idea, a party is an idea that has institutions that are, pinning it down to the earth. But basically what it is something that can be constantly renegotiated through images, through ideas, through stories. Okay, now let's now really come down to the ground. So we share a public space, we share a neighborhood, we share a work environment with people who have a different idea of what this is, and therefore have a different idea of who should be in charge of this. And we want to find a way to coexist. Or maybe we should think about going past coexisting. We want to find a way that acknowledges the profound interconnection that we have with them. Or maybe we just want to find a way to bear hearing their views and being in a world where their views are circling around. Whatever the case may be, we have an opportunity in those situations of really looking at what that sense of divisiveness is about and what we ourselves are doing when we say, that's not me. That's not the country I live in. That's not the country I want to live in. What are we doing, and where are we positioning the other person when we do that? Right? And, I'm starting from an assumption that we want to be tolerant people. We want to be able to live generously. We want to be able to live compassionately. And when we find ourselves in deeply polarized social environments, that's really hard to do. So what are some of the resources or ways of thinking that we have at our disposal when we're in those situations? And how does that connect with our own interest in working on ourselves? A spiritual practice, a personal practice, whatever we want to call it. So here we're sharing spaces with other people, and we have the opportunity to ask ourselves, what kind of seat am I offering to this other person? What is the seat that this other to me is allowed to sit in? And is that a seat that other person would want to sit in? And here we are definitely assuming that we're sharing a house. It's not, it's not just our individual house that we want to keep these people out of our thoughts and out of our brain. We are sharing a larger home. And so when we interact with others, where are we situating them? And even not interacting with them, thinking about them, observing them, because that is all connected. It all affects each other. So, we're now in a deeply polarized environment where, there's a party system and most people are in one party or in the other party or kind of dislike both parties. But mostly, we're dividing up on one side or the other of the line. with lots of different options. But this tendency that we have to divide things in two. Why two? Two, because we're using the sense of what we're not to define who we are. And so you need to face what you're not. And so what you are and what you're not makes two. Basically, we're talking about a mental habit of thinking dualistically, a very profoundly ingrained mental habit of thinking in these dualistic terms, black and white, yes and no, this and that, me and my other. And when we start reflecting on these processes, we can start by acknowledging that who I make my other really is a way for me to see who I'm telling myself that I am. I'm not that. And when we say I'm not that, we kind of slip out of the need to really have a very clear vision of what we are. And that's tricky. It's tricky for us individually, and it's certainly tricky for us as a group. So when we're thinking about the people that we tell ourselves we're not, we can just acknowledge that this is not primarily about them. It is primarily about us and who we want to think of ourselves as being. And so just when we have a certain awareness of that, then when we look at the person with whom we disagree, who we situate on the other side of the line, we can recognize I'm kind of interacting with a construction, a view, a vision that I'm using to tell myself who I am. So I shouldn't believe 100% in what it is that I think the other is. And the idea in this perspective is that it takes two to play this tango. We put the other person in that place. The other person may not want to sit in the place that we put them, but they're putting us in their place for the other. And so we're trapped in this kind of, this duet where we're purposely getting out of phase with each other to try to assert that we're not the same. And when we start to recognize that we are constructing something together, then when we say, I don't really like the level of discourse, I don't like the tone, I don't like the public culture that's being created, then we have to acknowledge that we're part of it. And that's really good news, because that means there are things that we can change. And when we start thinking, rather than needing the other to change, we can start changing how we demand the other to be positioned in relationship to us, which they may not accept, but we keep insisting on it. And one thing that I think we can see in public discourse is that people who are on the liberal side of the line really have generated a tendency to have a stupid seat, have an uneducated seat. And that's where the people who are on the other side of the line need to sit. And I think we've probably all done that one way or other. Thinking that, we need to increase the level of education in this country, which is certainly sure, right? We need to increase the level of education in this country because look at what these people think, And there is a kind of, the values that are our values that we think are important, maybe qualities in ourselves that we appreciate or that we, have made an identity out of flourishing at, then those become the criteria by which we're judging the other. And that can be, intellectual agility. It can be financial success, it can be compassion, it can be anything. But when we find ourselves taking our positive qualities and making the other the one who lacks those qualities, we should know we are in the territory where dualistic thought becomes polarized country. And watching how this phenomenon that seems to be outside of us and a part of us that we have no control over, that we just are at the mercy of and have to live, suddenly we realize we've participated mentally in the production of the system much more than we might have liked to think. And that means that from right where we are, we can start making shifts. We don't want an intolerant country, then we do need to learn how to tolerate the people who are on the other side of the line. And so, there are some very practical ways that we can start reaching across and really practicing generosity and wanting to listen. And it's a very high level, advanced spiritual practice to really kind of wade into the vast river that's raging, and there are rapids and, all kinds of logs are flowing really fast through it. We want to wade across and try to be able to engage with someone who's from the other side. But before we do that, as a preparation for doing that, we should recognize we don't need to cross that gulch because they're already living here in our mind. We've created that category ourselves. And so I just want to propose as a kind of first foray, and I think we'll have a few weeks to start thinking about it. What is the place that we've set up in our own mind where we position the people with whom we profoundly disagree? And take it as an exercise for ourselves in expanding our mind, to try to imagine, on that other side of this divide, what could be the concerns, what could be the fears, what could be the insecurities, what could be, the old wounds, what could be the underlying current of despair, what could be the dashed dreams that are part of their experience, right? And so just reach out our minds, and let that river just for a few moments, just calm down, and imagine that they've, people who we consider other to ourselves have lived a whole life with all different kinds of experiences that have shaped them. And before we then open our eyes from that mental exercise and look at where we are, also, I think, acknowledge that a lot of why people want to find a place on one side or the other of this divide really has to do with a sense of belonging. We are not cogs that fit in only one place in the big machine. We could go anywhere. We could have this crazy idea of being teachers and living in all different kinds of cities around the world for a few years and knowing all different countries, and we could just do that. And we could make a place anywhere. Human beings have that capability. And what that means is when we long to know what our place is in the world, there is no our place. Any place could be our place. And therefore, there is no one place where we really know, looking around us, this is my place. This is the place for me. We can generate the sense of belonging ourselves by establishing connections. But there isn't in the world one place and only one place where we fit and where we belong. And yet we have this continual longing to experience our connectedness through this sense of belonging. And so we have this tension within us that there is no one place, and we long to know what that place is. In Buddhist teachings, basically we resolve that through learning how to be at home wherever we are, and letting go of the idea that that could only be one place that's defined by the external conditions and not by the internal conditions. But, before we get to the point and do all of that sort of work, we are sharing a world where we long to belong. Things are changing, especially in this past half century. Things are changing really fast, not just physically and materially. Our modes of relating to each other, the kinds of lifestyle that's available to us, is really changing rapidly, and that makes the need for belonging particularly acute, because we don't know that easily how to really flourish where we are when the external conditions are changing so quickly. And so just kind of when we're thinking about living in this polarized condition, to start giving us some criteria to have a deeper understanding of what it is that makes us willing to occupy this kind of a divisive environment. Because by being us, of course I need a them, but at least I belong to this us. And I think just, at this point, just understanding some of the forces that are working inside us and recognizing that these are universal forces that we're all subject to, that we're all sharing this experience, and that for the most part, nothing that I've said so far applies to only one side of the line. And so we're all experiencing these forces and all perceiving that they divide us, whereas in fact they're actually uniting us. And so I don't know how much this really gives us for working on a day-to-day level, but I think it's useful to just establish some kind of parameters for thinking collectively about how it is that we got ourselves into this situation, and start deconstructing that sense of being so different and so divided. And I think I want to leave it there for now, and we can talk and think about it together, and maybe next time try to take a step closer towards having some real day-to-day interactive tools for when we find ourselves, with our own, strong reactions to what's going on, and we find ourselves in mixed company and want to figure out, how to be more skillful at keeping our equanimity and our compassion present when that happens. One option that we have in the short term is when we find ourselves in difficult interactions, or when we find ourselves thinking with the other in ways that we notice is polarizing or is intolerant, we can shift our focus from the position that they're showing now, and as a thought exercise, really try to identify what conditions might have led them to take that position or to be in that position. What painful experiences, what insecurities, what circumstances that were not favorable to their flourishing could have resulted in the position that they're taking. So in this task that we have, which is really crucial in this work, to rehumanize the other, thinking about them, solidifying or deconstructing that monolithic vision we have of them, can be done through historic thinking. What trajectory could have led them to that point? So just as an exercise that can be done as conversations are going on, just really try to connect. What is the pain that could lead someone to that position? What is the fear that could lead someone to want to identify with a certain position? And I think also if we can kind of keep in mind that we do want to take a position. We just don't want to take sides. And any position that's worth taking in the area of what's good for everyone has to be something that is good for everyone, and therefore does not require placing the person on the other side. And so the action that we do and the thinking that we do, if we can think about for ourselves, how can I occupy the position that I want to occupy here without requiring that the other get over to his side of the line? And it's just something for us to be thinking about. It's a kind of a more subtle shift in how we express our values and our views. But it can also help us to think about the values and the views and be sure, is there really a place for everyone in what I'm expressing? Or does what I'm aspiring to require that those people just get out of the way and go away? Right? So just a little bit of practical applications that we can be trying to put in place between now and the next time we speak.